especially their young ones, about a school shooting. In the years that have followed, I have noticed that tragic events in the news have been reflected in headlines such as, "How do I talk to my kids about the fire? How do I talk to my children about police shootings? How do I tell my kids about riots?" And Ukraine and Gaza and Syria, and how do I tell my kids about war? While it's hard to really know how the levels of violence caused by humans and natural events, both in the US and globally, compare to the good old days, what is pretty clear is that reports of violence, including graphic images and descriptions, are much, much more common. Long gone are the days of the nightly news with Walter Cronkite. The news is no longer something you check in with once a day in the evening, but rather a constant inflow, inundation, maybe a better word, bombardment, of what we will loosely term information. While I notice the flow of headlines from various experts on how to talk to your kids about terrible things, as I don't have kids, and I don't even know anyone with kids that are actually children anymore, I never went to read them. But like many of us, I've become aware of a growing unease. While I am ostensibly aware that I am relatively safe where I am, at least for now, and that the impression of endless violence reflects an availability of information at least as much as any increase there might be in the violence, I still find myself feeling less safe where I am, and more stressed and concerned for others who are genuinely under fire, figuratively and literally. You know, that part of me that's not quite so rational, not so thoughtful, not so adult. My inner child is not doing so well, which led me to asking myself, how do I talk to my inner child about war? And about a lot of things that wouldn't even bother a real child, such as concerns over our political state, or if the economy is about to boom or crash, because these things concern my adult self. But like a child may react to their parents' stress, even if they don't understand or possibly even know about what's actually stressing them, so our inner child reacts to our adult concerns. Made me think that perhaps it was time to talk to myself like the frightened child that I am. Not quite sure how to do that, but a bunch of people with appropriate educations are writing news stories on just how to do that. So I thought maybe I'd just go off and read a few. I noticed quickly that advice was usually divided into segments based on the age of the child, which of course makes great sense because you probably want to talk to your 5-year-old a little bit different than your 15-year-old. It's also great in this purpose, as like most people's, my inner child is not exactly a consistent age. It's dependent on just what stimulus is pushing her buttons. This mostly undefined feeling of unease over stuff that even my adult self doesn't fully grasp is hitting pretty young. One of the things that parents are advised to do with young kids is to identify just what it is your child is afraid of. Parents are advised to talk to their kids and get from them what their fears are. So, have a conversation with yourself. Ask your young self what the problem is. And do try to avoid acting like real parents. And as soon as you get an answer, explain to your young self that there is no need to be afraid. We adults seem to think that just informing a child that something they are afraid of is not actually dangerous and worthy of fear will automatically make the fear go away, which it might if the child trusts you enough. Unfortunately, parents are notorious for dealing with scary things with their kids by pretending it isn't a problem, which if it's not true, the kids learn pretty quick that reassurances do not mean that people won't be stressed, upset, and or angry. Clear indications that something's going on, and hello, a scary situation in and of itself for young children. and inner children. And since most humans, when it comes to our own selves, lie like pennies in a parking lot, just saying, don't worry, honey, it's nothing that concerns you, to your inner child is not likely to help much. It's suggested with young kids that you need to acknowledge your child's fears, not just push them away. If they don't feel like it's okay to be afraid, you will be hard put to get them to talk about what they are afraid of. Your inner self is no different. Along with lying to ourselves like a cheap carpet, we are also prone to harsh and absolute self-judgment. It's quite possible that your inner child has no intention of telling you that you're afraid of something that you think you shouldn't be afraid of. But just like with your kids, calming yourself is much more effective if you actually deal with the real fear. No matter how harshly you may be inclined to judge yourself for actually letting that upset you. Parents are also advised at this stage to understand it may be difficult to get a cohesive answer from their kids. Besides being reluctant to tell mom what the problem is, a lot of times kids don't really know what they're afraid of. And your inner child, unfortunately, is no different. So the next suggestion is to try cycling through things around you that might be the problem and pay close attention to how your kid reacts. Real kids can get pretty good at hiding their fears, but lucky for us, your inner child is probably not so good at it. If I'm watching, I can tell right away if I think of something that hits my inner child's trigger. My heart rate goes up. Then my mind tries to move away from the thought. I'm uneasy. If I suddenly want to get up and do something to distract myself, I probably just hit pay dirt. I will remind us again, this is not the time to flatly tell your young kids or your inner child that they don't need to be afraid of what they are afraid of. Even when it's obvious to our adult selves that the fear does not really relate to anything that involves actual danger. Like real kids, your inner child needs to know that it's okay to be afraid. It's understandable to be afraid. And then go to calming down. This calming down stage is tricky, especially with young kids. Complex explanations as to why there really isn't an issue are not so useful with young kids or inner children. Young kids don't understand the complexities, and your inner child already knows all the facts and maybe doesn't really understand anyway. In addition to that, one of the problems with using complex explanations with your inner child is that the more complex they are, the easier they are to challenge. Not a big problem with young kids, but boy, howdy, it can be perilous to get into a fight with your inner child about justifications for not being afraid. We adults often deal with things that are scary, but which we have no control over, with clever rationalizations. Got a black belt in rationalization myself. In the process of trying to justify those rationalizations to our inner child, who, by the way, is as smart and knowledgeable as we are, we may end up seeing the holes too clearly to continue to be calmed by them, our adult self. Young kids, anyway, don't understand explanations so well as they understand emotions. In fact, most of us probably know and lament the reality that kids are much, much more aware of emotions in a pure way than adults are. Without doubt, the most effective thing that calms young kids is their parents actually truly being okay. And just like young kids, our child's self needs emotional reassurance and healing. That doesn't mean you're off the hook for explanations. But any explanations as to why there's not a need to worry need to be kept short, simple, and true. The war is a scary thing, but it's a long way from us. Combined with an emotional reassurance, and mommy and daddy are watching it, so it won't hurt you. If the reality is that don't worry, it will be okay is flat not true, then telling your kids not to worry is rarely useful for very long and pretty much not helpful at all with inner children. I'm going to take an aside here. What I'm mostly talking about today is situations that are not immediately threatening, usually things that are far away and in a practical sense do not interfere with our lives now directly at all. In the event that something is immediately active, while complex explanations are not useful, young kids respond surprisingly badly to refusal to say what's going on. It's nothing for you to worry about. You will be fine. Just do as you're told. Only works if mommy and daddy are really and truly acting like there's nothing to worry about and everything will be fine. If everyone's running around in a frenzy hollering, clearly frightened and upset, then you're much better with a simple but honest assessment of what is the problem, followed by a definitive statement of emotional safety. That is talking to your kids or your own self. We need to leave now because there's a fire burning near and it might hurt us. We're going to Aunt Betty's house. We will be safe there. It's surprisingly useful to tell yourself in a clear and direct way what's happening and what you're doing in an emergency. We can be prone to ignore our own emotional needs just like we might ignore the needs of a young child when we're pressed. But short of actually running for your life, just like young kids, it's usually worth it to offer your inner child a few words of reassurance. It's okay. We have a plan. It's a good plan. Just do what we planned and we'll be okay. You'll be safe. The cat will be safe. If the house is gone when it's over, we have another plan. We'll be okay. But what if you don't have a plan? If you're terrified and you don't know how you'll cope? Well, unfortunately, while lying to real kids in this situation is difficult but possible, lying to your inner child about how you feel and what you know is impossible. Your only choice is the same thing you have with real kids in a situation that needs immediate action, where you don't have an explanation to give or time to calm your child. You pick up the screaming kid, you hold on tight, and you run. And deal with the fallout later. In this case, you clamp a lid on your inner child and you do what you need to do, and you take time later to calm yourself down, which, by the way, is very important to do after an emergency, but most of us don't usually bother. But most of what I'm talking about today is the stuff that seems to be bothering our collective inner children is not immediate danger. In fact, almost none of it is affecting our lives in clear and direct ways. Yet, every time a war starts or other big bad events happen into the news, like destructive natural disasters or the Capitol riots or large mass shootings, several markers of widespread national stress spike, including increases in diagnosis of anxiety and depression, increases in measured levels of stress hormone and other physiological changes, and self-reported increase in stress levels after the event. Trust me, you are not alone if a hurricane obliterating half of North Carolina leaves you feeling vaguely uneasy. It isn't just the people affected by the tragedy, but the nation as a whole grieves. And while we might tell our inner child that there's no good reason to carry stress about a hurricane in Florida or a war in Ukraine, we really do have lots of company for our worry fest. It's natural to be concerned. We think of these people as our tribe. And our brain doesn't really understand the extent to which we didn't used to get a blow-by-blow account of every superstorm that hits the East Coast. News of every bad thing going on seems to land in some form of an inbox, with many, many players happy to explain to us why this thing is dangerous to us. And the biggest likely issue with our inner child and events far away or speculative is the question of, what if? What will I do if the economy crashes and I lose half my pension? What will I do if this summer is 110 plus for weeks on end? Oh, right, it was. What will happen if Trump gets elected? Okay, well, what will I do if my insurance company cancels my house policy? I'm not the only one with that problem. Answering these what if questions from your frightened self will be much more involved than what you would explain to your 6-year-old. The inner child you're dealing with for this is probably more intellectual. Time to start reading up on talking to teenagers. Teenage kids do much better when parents talk to them about a situation in a realistic, not patronizing way and help them to understand what might happen, and most important, what will be done about it if it does happen. Oh, and you're not off the hook for emotional reassurance. Teenagers and your more mature self still need it. Answering, but what will we do if the water doesn't come out of the tap anymore with, oh, don't worry, that won't happen, is not likely to help out your 16-year-old or yourself either, especially if the news has been screaming drought, drought, drought for 3 years running. If you've evacuated 5 times in the past 3 years for fire and your insurance has dropped the policy, the idea that your house might burn down is obviously real. And convincing yourself that it isn't not only is not likely to be easy, but doesn't seem prudent. And the most useful answer for your teenager or yourself to a what if that really looks possible is an answer. In other words, a plan. Obviously, some amount of planning will make a disaster much less disastrous. Too much planning and you can eat up your life and lose track of the fact that you don't actually have a disaster today. But if you are afraid of it and it might happen, then one of the best things you can do for your well-being is to make a plan. Even if it's only in your head, just knowing what your first step is, if it happens, can go a long way toward calming your stressed inner child. Actually doing things to prepare probably will help even more. I remember watching my friend Asha and her household progressively deal with floods on the Russian River. The water wasn't likely to ever get to their house, but it didn't take much of a flood before access of the house was cut, and power and phone probably also cut. When they first moved into the house, Asha stressed every rainfall of a flood. And when the first time came, when they had to leave, it was a panicked evacuation to a hotel they could barely afford, where they sat and mostly twiddled their thumbs and worried about the house for the duration. So after that, they made a hotel fund and they parked a car up the hill where they could get out during the flood season. They made sure they had some shelf-stable food and bottled water in the house. Less stress, still expensive, not fun. That part of the river flooded about every 3rd year. By the 3rd flood in the house, they had a generator that came on automatically, battery lamps, board games, a laptop that played DVDs, a 2-way radio, plenty of food in the house, the propane tank full, and frankly, just had a grand old time kicking back, not needing to go to work, and waiting for the water to go down. And the question of what will we do if the river floods no longer stress them. One of the things suggested with teenagers is to involve them in the planning and preparing for a what if that you know might be coming. Sit down with yourself and figure out what would make that event less stressful for you when it happens. And take at least some time to address what stresses you. Just like a teenager needs to know that the parents are taking at least some notice of what the kid needs, there's a child self inside of you that also knows that at least some attention being paid to what you are worried about, not just what the wildfire preparedness list says. Remember, you don't need to solve the problem completely in one fell swoop. Just find a way to make it better and then go through some steps to prepare so you can show it to yourself when you get stressed. See, self, you have a go bag packed and everything that you really can't live without is in it. Or, okay, take a deep breath. You've got 4 weeks of food in the cupboard now. If that layoff hits you, your kids won't starve. If you have something that realistically falls into the category of not bloody likely to actually happen, but you're afraid of it anyway, whether with your teenager or yourself, you need to separate out the fear from the event. Humans are prone to be afraid of things with an intensity that often has little or nothing to do with the actual likelihood of it happening. A well-worn example of this is people who are afraid to fly, but not afraid to drive 50 miles to the airport, a statistically much more dangerous action. But driving is familiar. We do it all the time and nothing happens. So we deem it safe. We don't fly so much, and any airline crash makes the news. So we might well hear of more airline crashes than we have airline flights over the course of a decade. And it's so high up, and you would be completely helpless. The imagination can run wild. So how afraid you are of losing your job, or the bank failing, or a gunman coming into Walmart while you're there really might not be rooted in any actual danger, but rather personal fear. Personal fears can be quite a bit harder to ferret out than situational fears. You really have to sit down with yourself and investigate just what about the situation is making you afraid. Why are you disturbed about a war starting? Are you afraid that the war will affect our economy? Are you afraid the war might expand to the US? Is there a reason why the war might touch you personally? Do you feel empathy for the people there? Do you feel like the soul of the world is wounded and weakening us all? Or other things? It helps to know, to figure out what it is, what it really is, without judgment about what it should be. Don't say something to yourself like, "What's wrong with you? A war starts and you're stressed over your pension instead of worrying about the people caught up in it." Well, first off, just because your pension is keeping you up awake at night doesn't mean that you're not concerned about the people. And second, there's nothing wrong with being concerned about the things that affect you. After all, your first responsibility to your community is to take care of yourself. And at third, it really doesn't matter anyway, because you still need to deal with the real issue, whatever it is, so you can talk to your inner child about those things. Once you've figured it out, then you need to take a good hard look at reality with the goal to bring your reaction in line with the actual danger associated with the event. Are you bothered by hurricanes because you're stressed about global warming, for instance? I'm not saying that this is not a valid fear, but it's not the same kind of fear as someone living on the Gulf Coast would feel, and it should be dealt with differently. Of course, something that might happen that you can prepare for is the easy form of might happen, probably will happen. It's a little harder to do anything to prepare for the news that 2 kindergartners were wounded today in a school just down the road, or that on the other side of the state it's burning down again. They both, or that a tornado killed almost 200 people in a small town, or that another war started in another place where humans are trying to live. And while it's true that these things don't affect us directly, they both indicate and create a world in conflict with the world we want to live in. And we know that in the long run, these things do affect our lives. And yet, we have virtually no control over them, no way to prepare for them. And the only answer you really have to the question of what if a firestorm rips through LA neighborhoods, destroying thousands of homes and killing some and is still going and the wind's about to blow again, is I will grieve. I will cry. I will get angry. I will deny. I will talk to my friends. I will find causes and places to help. I will pray. I will cling to the news. I will yell at God. I will turn off the news. I will apologize to God. I will thank God. I will blame God. I will yell again. I will talk again. I will pray again until I'm done. And then I'll go back to living. Blessed be.